Alright, welcome everyone back to the stream. Today is day 16 of becoming a full stack developer in 8 months. This time, guys, I got a foolproof way of displaying the subscribers. Now, the alerts might still not work. It might still not show who subscribed to me, but at least we're going to see the live sub count this time, and it's foolproof. It's going to update automatically. This is straight from YouTube, so we should have no issues with that finally. And let me pull up the chat and we can start with today's lesson, which is on CSS Frameworks and Preprocessors. Alright, let me zoom in a little bit so you can read as well. And we're starting off. Perfect. So, CSS Frameworks and Preprocessors. Introduction. At this point, you have written quite a bit of vanilla HTML and CSS and learned many design techniques that you continue to use as you grow as a developer. Throughout your experience, you may have come across information on CSS frameworks and preprocessors, aka precompilers. Both of these types of tools can make writing CSS more streamlined and less tedious. A useful reason to be aware of CSS frameworks and preprocessors is that they are commonly found in the workplace, whilst interviewers for entry-level positions are likely to focus more on CSS fundamentals. Even if the job uses a particular framework or preprocessor, it's helpful for you to know what these tools are and where to look for them once you've determined you need to learn them. You should be aware that at this point of your learning, it is advised to continue using vanilla CSS in your projects. All of these frameworks and preprocessors are based around CSS, and so developing strong fundamentals makes it significantly easier to learn and switch between any framework or preprocessor in the future. Trying to learn one during this course will not be as productive or valuable in the long run as improving your fundamental CSS skills. Alright, so I thought we're basically going to pick up a framework from now on, or preprocessor actually, and use that, but it seems like it's not the case, which is also fine. I've been using SAS and CSS back in the day when I made some just front-end projects, so I'm kind of familiar with them. So this lesson contains a general overview of topics that you will learn in this lesson. Know what a CSS framework is, know some of the available frameworks, know what a preprocessor is, now know some of the available preprocessors. Alright, so frameworks overview. Different frameworks have different goals. Frameworks like Bootstrap do a lot of the heavy lifting of packaging up a commonly used CSS code for you. Even icons and interactions like menu dropdowns are designed to abstract away the process of coding intuitive, reusable, and responsive elements. Things like Tailwind aim to change how we apply CSS to a different syntax by supplying pre-named classes that typically only apply a single line of CSS each. A CSS framework is ultimately just a bundle of CSS that you can use and access using the classes defined by the framework. For example, many frameworks provide a class called .btn that will add all the needed styles to your buttons without you having to write any CSS. In general, to use a framework, you need to understand how it expects you to structure your website and which classes it uses to apply its specific set of styles. Okay, you should be aware that there are quite a few frameworks available. Two other frameworks you may come across are Bulma and Foundation, but there are many more out there. Alright, so those are the frameworks overview, and now we're going to read about the disadvantages. Sure. So frameworks are great for rapidly producing sites with interfaces that end users can easily interact with. However, once you've taken a tour through some of the popular frameworks, you start noticing an awful lot of similarities between a lot of sites you encounter due to similar use of frameworks. In addition to that issue, too many new developers also jump into learning frameworks too early in their education. The prospect of not having to practice writing vanilla CSS is very tempting. As a result, many developers don't get enough CSS practice under their belts to solidify the fundamentals of this very important language. Additionally, the process of overwriting a framework styling or debugging style issues on your page becomes very difficult if you have weaker CSS fundamentals. It's imperative to understand what a framework is doing under the hood so that you are equipped to handle these issues later, and trust us, you have to. Alright? Ultimately, frameworks can help you get up and running quickly, but they can constrain you in the long run. Once you've started a project using a framework, it can be difficult to remove it. In the future, you or your employer may have to decide whether or not to use a framework for a project, and if so, which one. Cool. So that was about frameworks, and now about preprocessors. So preprocessors, aka precompilers, are languages that help you write CSS more easily. They can reduce code repetition and provide all sorts of time-saving and code-saving features, for example, by allowing you to write loops and conditionals and join multiple style sheets. CSS preprocessors are essentially extensions to vanilla CSS that provide some extra functionality. When you run the preprocessor, it takes your code and turns it into vanilla CSS that you can import into the project. Preprocessors do have some unique and helpful tools, but many of their most helpful features have been implemented in vanilla CSS, so it might not be worth the overhead of learning one unless you think you really need those features. For example, you have already learned about custom properties, which used to be something only possible with preprocessors. CSS nesting also used to become an advantage of some preprocessors, but has now made its way into vanilla CSS and has recently started getting more browser support. Some of the standard preprocessors are SAS, LESS, and Stylus. So, as I said, I've used SAS before. Alright, and in the assignment we have, I guess, 3 articles, which are brief overview of CSS frameworks, overview of SAS, LESS, and Stylus, and some disadvantages to using a CSS preprocessor. After that, I don't know why, but they've linked a whole documentation as an additional resource. Which I'm definitely not going through. I kind of understand those already, but yeah, I guess if I need it one day, I'm going to go through the documentation, but as of right now, I think we'll skip it. Alright, so let's go on with the articles. This one is quite short. No, thank you. Alright, and let me zoom in a little bit. Perfect. So, what is a CSS framework? Bootstrap, Tailwind, Materialize, and more. CSS frameworks are tools used by UI developers to make their job easier. Rather than reinventing the wheel each time a new project comes up, frameworks give developers the tools to quickly spin up user interfaces that can be tweaked and iterated on throughout the project instead of spending time starting from a blank document. They are also useful in large teams and help those of us that need to create a team for use in more than one project. Oftentimes, however, CSS framework websites are little ambiguous to complete beginners, filled with buzzwords and descriptions that only more senior developers will catch on to, and it's difficult for beginners to tell when and which framework they should start learning. In its simplest form, a CSS framework is a collection of CSS style sheets that are prepped and ready to use. They're tailored for use in common situations like setting up navbars and are often expanded upon by other technologies such as SAS and JavaScript. Think of it like a colleague giving you a completed CSS style sheet for a home page you're setting up. Basically, all you need to do is write up your HTML with the appropriate structure, classes and IDs, and you're off to the races. However, instead of that style sheet being specifically for the home page you're working on, it's ready to accommodate a general standard of home page, having classes for things commonly found on other home pages, in example navbars, footer slider, hamburger menu, 3-column layout. This allows you to quickly set up web pages without having to deep dive into some CSS, saving a bunch of time. Okay, perfect. So time savings aren't the only benefit gained by using CSS frameworks. Teams with multiple developers, especially larger ones, can really appreciate the standards that frameworks bring to the table. Instead of each developer bringing their own flavor of class names to a project, frameworks standardize layouts and allow one developer to easily read another developer's code. This saves time but also allows for a smoother development cycle with less bugs and easier team communication. If you've ever been thrown into the deep end of a nearly complete project and told to fix up the UI, you know the pain that frameworks can alleviate. It is important to remember that jumping right into a framework as a newbie isn't recommended. Sometimes folks just want to get started as quickly as they can, and they see frameworks as a way to jumpstart their goals. While that's true for spinning up projects, it can be harmful to your long-term career, as you'd be missing out on learning the basic skills that can be applied across the board. For example, by learning CSS in its pure form first, you can easily search frameworks documentation for how to do the most things you are doing with pure CSS. It also allows you to easily identify issues within your syntax and can lead to easier customizations when you need to tweak the framework you're using. On the flip side, if you jump right into something like Bootstrap, you'd be setting yourself up for learning Bootstrap's way of laying things out and how they structure their classes. While you'd be insanely fast at spinning up a UI in Bootstrap, using pure CSS or even just another framework will often stump you, and you won't have that pure CSS knowledge to help problem solve and troubleshoot. To be clear, this is my opinion on the matter. Many UI developers have started using frameworks straight away and were able to expand their skills beyond the ones they started with. Okay, if you think you're ready to start using CSS frameworks, there are a lot out there to choose from. Having used a few myself with varying degrees of experience, I can say that they're extremely useful. This is especially true if you choose the right one for your given use case. In my next piece, I'll be discussing how to choose which framework is right for you, and I'll be going over the three that I've used: Bootstrap, Tailwind CSS, and Materialize. Good afternoon, my boy. What is up, my SQL coding? Good to see you, my guy. Welcome back to the stream. I appreciate you tuning in. Okay. That was the whole article right here. I thought we were going to go more into detail about Bootstrap, Tailwind, CSS, so on. But seems like we don't. Alright. Then I guess we go into the preprocessors, and let me remove some of this because it's a bit annoying. This one I don't need. This one as well. The footer here. Okay. This is a little bit better. Alright, so comprehensive CSS preprocessor comparison, Sass versus less versus stylus. It has been a while since the concept of CSS preprocessor made its debut into the mainstay of front-end web development workflow and changed the way we code CSS. To say that its impact is pushing the limits of what CSS can achieve has been nothing short of revolutionary would be a grave understatement. To all the front-end developers actively arguing around the debate for Sass versus less in their projects, I can only hope that your neck isn't sore from nodding in agreement. Alright, so this guy has some humor. It would be unfathomable to go back to the days without Sass, stuck in the messy quagmire of vanilla CSS code, which often proved difficult to manage and organize as you scale up. Yet quite a lot of beginners and even some experienced developers are doing a great disservice to themselves by being reluctant to adopt CSS preprocessors and continue to ignore them. In this article, we'll explore what CSS preprocessors are, what their advantages, their features, comparing the most popular types of CSS processors being used, and finally how to set them up in your project. This was in 2019. Okay, so I'm not sure how up to date that is, but since it's still in the Odin project, we'll reiterate. Alright, so what is a CSS preprocessor? CSS in itself is devoid of complex logic and functionality, which is required to write reusable and organized code. As a result, a developer is bound by limitations and would face extreme difficulty in code maintenance and scalability, and especially when working on large projects involving extensive code and multiple CSS style sheets. This is where CSS Preprocessor came to the rescue. A CSS Preprocessor is a tool to extend the basic functionality of vanilla CSS through its own scripting language. It helps us use complex logical syntax like variables, functions, mixins, code nesting, and inheritance, to name a few, supercharging your vanilla CSS. By using CSS preprocessors, you can seamlessly automate menial tasks, build reusable code snippets, avoid code repetition and bloating, and write nested code blocks that are well organized and easy to read. However, browsers can only understand native vanilla CSS code and will be unable to interpret the CSS preprocessor syntax. Therefore, the complex and advanced preprocessor syntax needs to be first compiled into native CSS syntax, which can then be interpreted by the browsers to avoid cross-browser comparability issues. While different preprocessors have their own unique syntaxes, eventually all of them are compiled to the same native CSS code. Moving forward in the article, we'll take a look at the three most popular CSS preprocessors currently being used by developers around the world, which are Sass, Less, and Stylus. Before we decide the winner between Sass, Less, and Stylus, let us get to know them. Let us get to know them in detail first. So, style is syntactically awesome style sheets. Here they say Sass is not the most popular CSS processor in the world, but also one of the oldest, not only the most popular. So it is, I'm sorry. It is the most popular and also one of the oldest, launched in 2006. Although Sass is written in Ruby language, a pre-compiler, libsass, allows Sass to be parsed in other languages and decouple it from Ruby. Sass has a massive active community and extensive learning resources available on the net for beginners, thanks to its maturity, stability, and powerful logical prowess. Sass has established itself to the forefront of CSS processors ahead of its rival peers. Sass can be written in two syntaxes, either Sass or SCSS. What is the difference between the two? Let's find out. So, SCSS stands for Sassy CSS. Unlike Sass, SCSS is not based on indentation. .sass extension is used as original syntax for Sass, while SCSS offers a newer syntax with .scss extension. Unlike Sass, SCSS has curly braces and semicolons, just like CSS. Contrary to SCSS, Sass is difficult to read as it's quite deviant from CSS, which is why SCSS is the more recommended Sass syntax, as it's easier to read and closely resembles native CSS, while at the time enjoying the power of Sass. Back in the day when I wrote Sass, I liked Sass more than SCSS because it was based on indentation and didn't have those semicolons. Consider the example below with Sass versus SCSS syntax along with the compiled CSS code. Alright, so Sass syntax is at the top, and basically how they name variables is the same time, but here, as you can see, we don't have the semicolons and we also don't have the brackets. We're using indentation instead. Compiled CSS, in both cases, be it Sass or CSS, the compiled CSS code will be the same. Alright. One thing that stands out to me is, but that's not really the case. I was just going to say you're writing less code, but this way you can use these font colors and background colors in other places, and also you can do it in vanilla CSS, so it's basically the same. Alright, so usage of Sass. Arguably the most popular front-end framework, Bootstrap, is written in Sass. Up until version 3, Bootstrap was written in Less, but Bootstrap 4 adopted Sass and boosted its popularity. A few of the big companies using Sass are Zapier, Uber, Airbnb, and Kickstarter. So we're done with Sass and we're now up to Less, which is leaner style sheets. LESS is an acronym for Linear Style Sheets. It was released in 2009 by Alexis Sellier, 3 years after the initial launch of Sass in 2006. While Sass is written in Ruby, LESS is written in JavaScript. In fact, LESS is a JavaScript library that extends the functionality of native vanilla CSS with mixins, variables, nestings, and rule-set loops. Sass versus LESS has been a heated debate. It is no surprise that LESS is the strongest competitor to Sass and has the second largest user base. However, when Bootstrap dumped LESS in favor of Sass with the launch of Bootstrap 4, LESS has want in popularity. I think it's just decreased in popularity. One of the few disadvantages of LESS over Sass is that it does not support functions. Unlike Sass, LESS uses the @ to declare variables, which might cause confusion with @media and keyframes. However, one key advantage of LESS over Sass and Stylus or any other preprocessor is the ease of adding it in your project. You can do that by either using npm or by incorporating less.js file. Syntax decoration uses .less extensions. Syntax of LESS is quite similar to SCSS, with the exception that for declaring variables instead of $, we use the @ Alright, so right here I don't see anything that we cannot do with vanilla CSS. Usage of LESS. The popular Bootstrap framework until the launch of version 4 was written in LESS. However, another popular framework called Semantic UI is still written in LESS. Among the big companies using Sass are Indiegogo, Patreon, and WeChat. And now we have Stylus. Okay. The Stylus was launched in 2010 by former Node.js developer, nearly 4 years after the release of Sass and 1 year after the release of LESS. The Stylus is written Node.js. The Stylus is written Node.js and fits perfectly with JS stack. The Stylus was heavily influenced by the vocal prowess of the Sass and simplicity of LESS. Even though Stylus is still popular with Node.js developers, it hasn't managed to carve out a sizable share for itself. One advantage of Stylus over Sass and LESS is that it's armed with extremely powerful built-in functions and it's capable of handling heavy computing. Syntax decoration for Stylus uses style extension. Stylus offers a great deal of flexibility in writing syntax, supports native CSS, as well as allows omission of brackets, colons, and semicolons. Also note that Stylus does not use @ or $ symbols for defining variables. Instead, Stylus uses the assignment operators to indicate a variable decoration. So I think this is the cleanest way out of the three. And not too shabby, but again, style syntax without colons and semicolons. Also, you can use it without semicolons and brackets. Cool. Okay. Stylus syntax with curly braces. Usage of Stylus. So, some noteworthy frameworks written in Stylus are Basis and Q2Swiss. Among the big companies using Stylus are Accenture, Hacker Earth, and Coursera. popularity of CSS preprocessors. Even though native CSS is advancing and moving ahead by leaps and bounds, adding support for new features like custom property values, variables, CSS properties still enjoy widespread popularity and wavering loyalty among developers. As per the popular front-end tooling survey by Ashley Nolan, a vast majority of 86.86% of developers are using some kind of CSS preprocessor, SAS being the pack leader, whereas 13.14% of developers are still sticking to writing vanilla CSS without any preprocessors. Cool. We didn't hear anything about post CSS. They said CSS is at second place, but at the time of writing it doesn't seem to be the case. Anyways, it's barely a surprise that the war between SAS versus less versus styles or others is clearly dominated by SAS, bagging a majority of 77.27% share, almost 20% increase from the previous year, although SAS has progressed with a bigger percentage to 7.52%. The overall percentage of users adopting is still pretty low. If we talk about SAS versus less versus styles, the popularity in 2019 is a little sluggish, with an increase of just 1% compared to 2018. And I'm interested about this in 2024, so let's see if we have 2024. State of CSS 2024. Alright, that was actually 6 days ago by CSS Tricks. So what is this? Which age group did the respondents are? Number of question respondents. This is set frameworks. Missing CSS features. We didn't hear anything about preprocessors. Stack Overflow. Nope. There's an announcement that it's open, but I don't see any graph like the one they presented. Variables. No, I don't see any graphs. Maybe on images. This is, I think, the same one. Yep, exactly the same. Alright, anyways, moving forward. Another key survey called State of CSS 2019. Is this the same by, no. 20, can we change this to 2024? Oops, not 2014, 2024. Not found, so either it's still not out or they don't maintain this site anymore. But I don't think they do, since the other years are also missing. Alright, anyways. Reflects a similar sentiment but offers a deeper insight into the popularity of different CSS processors. As far as user share among preprocessors is concerned, SAS, as expected, has the mammoth share of 80%, followed by less with 47, and finally styles with 14. The survey also reflects that experienced developers are more likely to use some kind of CSS processors than beginners with low experience. One of the most interesting insights that the State of CSS survey offers is awareness, interest, and satisfaction ratio rankings. SAS has managed to win the top spot again, leading all three categories with an awareness of 100%, interest 59%, satisfaction at a high of 90%, even though less enjoys the same level of awareness as SAS. Interest ratio has taken a massive dip and satisfaction level is just shy of 50%. The styles has the least awareness ranking but has nearly the same scores when it comes to interest and satisfactions. Okay, best compiler tools for CSS preprocessors. As we discussed earlier, CSS preprocessors like SAS, less or styles syntax cannot be interpreted by browsers. It needs to be first compiled into CSS. This can be easily done by using third-party compilers or code editor extensions as mentioned below. We have a live SAS compiler, which is a VS Code extension. I think I've used that before, but I don't remember. This Preproc is a free cross-platform compiler available for Linux, for Windows, macOS, and Linux. It can compile all major 3 CSS preprocessors. Okay, sure. CodeKit is a premium development tool for macOS. CodeKit is the most feature-rich compiler that comes packed with image optimizer, minified, cache buster, built-in NPM, and several CSS frameworks along with debugging tools. But we're on Linux, we don't have macOS still. Why using CSS preprocessors in every case isn't a good idea. Although CSS preprocessor like SAS, less, or styles have a proved to be handful in front-end development workflow and has a long list of merits to their names, there are particular instances where you might not encounter the need to use these preprocessors. Don't use them for the sake of variables. If you're planning to use SAS or some other CSS preprocessor only for the sake of variables, then native CSS can then more cater to your needs. The custom properties are user-defined variables created using dash notation and accessed using var function. A custom property can be defined inside any element, but the popular convention is to define custom property variable globally inside the root selector. So we already learned about these CSS variables in the previous lesson yesterday. One advantage of using native CSS custom property variable over SAS or less variable is that they are updated dynamically instead of after being compiled. Remember, native CSS offers calc functionality. Native CSS also offers calc functionality to perform calculation for property value. Coupled with CSS custom property variable, it can prove to be quite useful. You can't gain absolute control over CSS with preprocessors. So if you wish to have an absolute direct control over CSS instead of relying on compiled CSS, then preprocessors might not be your cup of tea. If you're facing problems in understanding how and why a particular compiled CSS code has been generated from a preprocessor, then stick to vanilla CSS until you have a deeper understanding of how that preprocessor syntax works. CSS preprocessors aren't for everyday code deployment. If you wish to keep your code deployment ready at all times instead of constant compilation from CSS processor to native CSS after each change, Although using third-party preprocessor compilers like Preproc or code editor extensions like LiveSASS in VS Code can automatically compile your SAS to other preprocessor code into vanilla CSS and update changes in a browser window using Live Preview. So SAS, less and stylus, what is your pick? The big three continue to dominate the CSS preprocessor race, with SAS and CSS enjoying the status of the undisputed leader in popularity. All three preprocessors have almost similar features and functionalities. Every CSS preprocessor accomplishes a given task in their own characteristic, unique way, enabling developers to use extremely powerful tools to write clean code and blistering pace. While SAS has the largest user base and active community, less is the easiest to compile and integrate. On the other hand, stylus is still a popular choice for Node.js developers as it continues the extensive logical prowess of SAS with the simplicity of less. Some other CSS preprocessors that you can explore are Please, CSS Crush, Meet, Garden and Rework. In the end, the choice of CSS preprocessor would largely depend on the developer's preference and project requirement. Did I miss out on your favorite CSS processor? Let me know in the comments below. Till next time. Okay, perfect. So if I had to, I'd probably choose SAS, but as of right now, yesterday, I came to the understanding that CSS has evolved a lot since I last used it, and maybe CSS preprocessors are less and less needed, and maybe I will not have to use one, but we'll see in the future. So this one is quite short. This is about the disadvantages of CSS preprocessors. CSS preprocessors have many advantages, but like most tools, they also have a number of drawbacks, which I'll describe here. So debugging is harder. Preprocessors have a compilation step, meaning that CSS line numbers are irrelevant when trying to debug your code, but debugging is twice as hard as programming, so this alone is a huge drawback. Source maps provides a solution, but they need to be set up and they don't work in all browsers, particularly those where bugs often come up. Without source maps, we're left to search for rules in hope that we find what we're looking for. So that basically means you'll be writing SAS code, for example, and in your editor you have a set number of lines, but after it's compiled into regular CSS, the browser may throw an error if you have one on a specific line, but it will show you the CSS line error, which you will not be able to see in your IDE, so it will be harder to debug. You have to search for it manually. Compilation slows down the development. Compilation times can be really slow, even when using the best tools on the fastest computer. You know that feeling you get when you refresh and you don't see any changes. That they can produce very large CSS files. Source files might be small, but the generated CSS could be huge, which is what counts. We need to be aware that in using a CSS preprocessor, we're losing some control. Maintenance and over-engineering. It's common to see coder authors using red variable, for example, but this is of little value in terms of maintainability. If the code changes, then we need to update the name and the value, making the abstraction pointless. Not only there are alternatives to variables and mixins, which I'll cover later, but a search and replace may be all we need. Tooling and developer convenience. CSS preprocessors require extra tooling. Code authors shouldn't be forced to use particular editor just to be able to use the tool. That's the tail wagging the dog. Also, extra stuffs add complexity. This needs to be understood, upgraded and maintained, all of which increases costs and higher risk of problems. Saving generated files or not. Whether we should save the generated CSS or not is something we don't agree on as a community, in which case it's time for some consensus-driven development. This is an interesting term. Alright. Then we have capability and understanding. Whilst CSS preprocessors and the workflows around them have become widespread, there is still a knowledge gap, particularly when it comes to understanding the trade-offs. There is a big difference between understanding a tool and using it effectively without introducing other problems. What about variables, mixins and nesting? A solid approach of writing maintainable CSS solves most problems. In any case, we can mimic variables and mixins by using comma delimited CSS selectors. And whilst we can repetitively qualify our selectors to mimic nesting, it's not something that makes it makes for performant CSS. Instead, we should use a convention maintainable CSS has the following convention: module component state. That's interesting. We can read through that as well. Summary: it's easy to add CSS preprocessors to a text tag, but it's not easy to remove it down the line. So should we choose to remove it down the line? It's our responsibility to consider the impact they have on our workflow before making the easy decision to install one. Alright, so that was the article. I just quickly want to glance over these conventions. Module component state. Square brackets are optional depending on the module in question. Here are some examples. So module container is search results, component is the search results heading, and state is search results is loading. So these are different classes that we're targeting. Component and state are both delimited by a dash. Component and state, yeah. Names are written with lower camel case. Selectors are prefixed with the module name. Must I give a class name to every CSS element? No, you can write search results P if you want to, and sometimes you may have to if, for example, you're using Markdown, but beware that if you nest a module which contains a P, it will inherit the styles and need overriding. Why must I prefix the module name? Good question. Here's some HTML without a prefix. So you have a div with the class of basket and another div with the class of heading. So you have the module of basket and heading component of the basket module. There are two problems. When viewing the HTML, it's hard to differentiate between a module and a component. And the basket and heading component will inherit styles from the heading module, which has unintended side effects. the basket heading component, we will inherit styles from the heading module. That's interesting. Maintainable CSS. Write CSS without worrying that. Alright, I might bookmark this for the future. But anyways, I'm not reading through documentations. With that, we're complete with this lesson, and we're now 60% complete. And after that, we're going to be looking at input fields. So I'm going to start a quick 10-minute timer and have a quick break, and after that I'll be right back so we can discuss the form basics. Okay, starting the timer, and then I guess we go to extension, post and mix question. My mic is not working. My mic is not working. I'm trying to fix it. Right. Okay, yeah, this is good. Okay, taking a 10-minute break and I'll be right back. Alright. I am back and we can continue with form basics. Now, I have used forms before, obviously, so I think this shouldn't be that big of a deal, but I can see it's a longer lesson for sure. Maybe I've forgotten quite a bit, but let's see. Complete your first form, how to structure form. We have a few articles to go through. Okay, so let's see how long this will take us. Forms. Forms are one of the most crucial parts of your site. They're your user's gateway into your backend. The user provides data in a form and you do stuff with it. You need to specify the proper types of inputs for each possible data item, since there are often multiple ways to collect a piece of data, but only one way is the easiest for your user. That makes a lot of sense, actually. In this lesson, we will explore the basics of HTML forms and do some of the different types of inputs available for you. Lesson overview: create forms with HTML. Have a basic idea of how to style forms. The form element is a container element like the div element we've learned earlier in the curriculum. The form element wraps all of your inputs a user will interact on a form. The form element accepts two essential attributes. The first is the action attribute, which takes a URL value and tells the form where it should send its data to be processed. Later in the curriculum, we'll learn to hook backend systems to front-end forms using this attribute. For now, it is only essential to know that what the action attribute is used for. The second is the method attribute, which tells the browser which HTTP request method it should submit the form to. It should use to submit the form. The get and post request methods are two you'll find yourself using the most. We use get when we want to retrieve something from a server. For example, uses get requests when you search and it gets the search results. Post is used when you want to change something on the server. For example, a user makes an account or makes a payment on a website. The markup for creating a form element looks like this. So we have the form action with the URL and the method. Form controls. To start collecting user data, we need to use form control elements. These are all the elements users will interact with on the form, such as text boxes, drop downs, check boxes and buttons. In the following few sections, we'll explore some of the form controls you'll be using most commonly. The input element is the most versatile of all of the form control elements. It accepts a type attribute which tells the browser what type of data it should expect and how it should render the input element. A text input looks like this, so input with the type of text. Text inputs accept any text input. For example, you would use it to collect things like users' first and last names. Labels. An input on its own isn't very useful, since the user will not know what kind of data they are supposed to provide. Instead, we give our inputs a label to inform users what type of data they are expected to enter. To create a label, we use the label element. The text we want displayed in the label will go in between its opening and closing tags. Okay, So here we have input with the type of text, an ID first name, label for first underscore name, so for the ID is first name. Labels accept a for attribute which associates with a particular input. The input we want to associate with the label needs an ID attribute with the same value as the label's for attribute. When a label is associated with an input and is clicked, it will focus the cursor on that input, ready for the user to go input some data. This helps make our forms more accessible to users who rely on assistive technologies. Placeholder attribute is to guide users on what to enter in form elements. We can include placeholder text in input fields. This is done by adding a placeholder attribute to an input. The value will be the placeholder text you want to display on the input. So yeah, placeholder, this is pretty self-explanatory. Use placeholder text to demonstrate how text should be entered and formatted. Alright. The name attribute. We need to use labels so that users understand what the data entered into an input will represent. Just like that, we also need to let the backend where we send our data know what each piece of data represents. We do this by adding a name attribute to our inputs. Okay, perfect. The name attribute serves a reference to the data inputted into a form control after submitting it. You can think of it as a variable name for the input. Form input should always have a name attribute, otherwise it will be ignored when the form is submitted. To get a better understanding of what it looks like, we can submit a form to HTTP bin. This service will send back a response which will let us view what data was submitted. Fill in the form below and click the submit. Alright, so submit. Alright, outputs the JSON. Alright, so we have age, first name, last name, form headers, accept, so on. This is like Postman but online. The output we care about from the response is the form object. It should look something like this. It does. Okay. Try changing the name attribute of some of the input fields in the form and removing the attribute entirely. Then submit the form again to see how the form data in the response. Can I return? Maybe here. No. Anyways. There you go. So remove the name you're saying. So first name, we can remove that. Alright, let's do the same now. And submit it. Now, as you can see, first underscore name is not even in the form output. It's not even in the object here. Using form controls outside of forms, it is worth mentioning that you can use any of the form controls HTML provides outside of the form element, even if you don't have a backend server when you can send data. For example, you might want to have an input that gets some data from a user and display that somewhere else on the page with JavaScript. Run pen. What is your name? Greet me. Hello. Yep. We will need to manipulate data from form controls like this in projects later in the curriculum. The type attribute Email inputs are specialized text input just for email addresses. They are different from text inputs in that they will display a different keyboard, which will include the @ symbol on mobile devices to make entering email addresses easier. They also validate that the user has entered a correctly formatted email address, but there will be more on validations later. To create an email input, we use an input element with type attribute of email. Password inputs are another specialized text input. They different from regular text input in that they mask the inputted data with another character, usually an asterisk or a bullet point, to prevent anyone from seeing what has been entered. A password input can be created by using the input element of type password. The number input only accepts number values and ignores any other characters the user tries to enter. We create a number input by using the input element with a type attribute of number. Okay. To collect dates from a user, we can use the date input. This input is unique because it provides a better experience for choosing dates by rendering a date picker calendar. Text area, while technically not an input element, the text area element provides an input box that can accept text that spans multiple lines, like user comments and reviews. It can also be resized by clicking and dragging the bottom right corner to make it bigger or smaller. To create a text area, we use the text area element. Unlike input elements, text area elements do have a closing tags. This allows you to wrap some initial content you might want the text area to display. Text area elements accept a couple of unique attributes that other form controls do not. These are rows and calls attributes. They allow you to control the initial height, rows and width calls of the text area. Selection elements. Sometimes you want users to select a value from a predefined list. This is where select elements will be useful. Select drop down. The select element renders a drop down list where the users can select an option. Syntactically select elements have similar markups to an ordered list. The select element wraps option elements, which are the options that can be selected. To create a select dropdown, we're using the select element. Any options we want to display within the select element are defined using the option elements. And here they have a select with the name of car, and they have the options. So this is a drop down here. They're not specifically saying it's a drop down, but the way they're doing it with the option makes it a drop down, or at least that's what I think. All the option elements should have a value attribute, otherwise the text content inside is used. This value will be sent to the server when the form is submitted. We can set one of the options to be the default selected element when the browser first renders the form by giving one of the options the selected attribute. So in this case, Volvo is selected by default. We may want to split the list of options into groups by using opt group element. The opt group element takes a label attribute which the browser uses as the label for each group. Okay. Footwear, quoting, select fashion. So if we give two options here, what is going to be sent to the server? Opt group element. The opt group element takes a label attribute which the browser uses as the label for each group. I'll have to try this out to see it. Radio buttons. Select drop downs are great for saving space on a page. When we have an extensive list of options we want users to choose from. However, when we have a smaller list of 5 or fewer options to choose from, it is often a better user experience to have them displayed on the page instead of hidden behind the drop down. In this case, we can use radio buttons. Radio buttons allow us to create multiple options that the user can choose from. To create radio buttons, we use the ever adaptable input element again with the type attribute of radio. I'm curious since label for child, adult, senior. I'm curious since they're not in a form or anything like that, if you cannot just select them all, because I know with radio buttons you can select only one, with checkboxes you can select multiple, but if it's just like that paste in the HTML, are you not going to be able to just check all of them? When we select one of the radio buttons and then select another, it will deselect the first one. Radio buttons know how to do this because they have the same name attribute. Okay. This is how the browser knows these elements are part of the same group of options. We can set the default selected radio button by adding the checked attribute to it. And this time the checked is the adult. Okay, checkboxes. Similar to radio buttons in that they allow users to choose from a set of predefined options, but unlike radio buttons, they allow multiple options to be selected at once. Okay. We can also have a single checkbox when we want users to toggle if we want something to be true or false, like signing up to a newsletter when they create an account, for example. We can set checkboxes to be checked by default on page load by giving them a checked attribute. Buttons. The button element creates clickable buttons that the user can interact with to submit forms and trigger other actions. To create a button, we use the button element. The content or text we want to have displayed inside the button will go within the opening and closing tags. The button element also accepts a type attribute that tells the browser which kind of button it's dealing with. There are 3 types of buttons available to us. Alright, so we have the submit. Once a user is finished filling in a form, they will need a way to submit it. There is a special button for this, the submit button. When a submit button is clicked, it will submit the form it is contained within. The type attribute has a value of submit by default. In example, if the type is not specified or the value provided is invalid. To create submit button, we use type submit. Okay. Reset button. A reset button clears all the data the user has entered into the form and sets all the inputs in the form back to when they were initially. So I didn't know about this reset button. I only knew about the submit, I think. Button with a type of button, that's also interesting, but a generic button, and the third and final one, can be used for anything. It's commonly used with JS for creating interactive UIs. To create a generic button, we use the button element with the type attribute of button. Alright, It is important to remember that a button within a form with the type value of submit, which happens to be the default value, will always try to make a new request and submit data back to the server. Hence, for buttons that are used within a form for different purposes other than submitting the data, the type attribute should always be specified to avoid unwanted effects of submitting a form. Cool. Organizing form elements. So using the correct inputs for the data we want users to enter goes a long way towards making our forms users friendly. However, in large forms, users can easily get overwhelmed and discouraged if there are many inputs to fill in. Luckily, HTML provides a couple of elements that make it easy to organize forms into selections that are visually distinct and manageable to digest. Fieldest element. The fieldest element is a container element that allows us to group related form inputs into one logical unit. To create a field set, why am I saying fieldest? Anyways, to create a field set, we use the field set element. Whatever form inputs we want to group together will go into the opening and closing tags of the field set. Container element, related form inputs. Okay, it is kind of an abstraction because they don't tell us a use case for that, so it's also hard to remember this way. So if I was making the lesson, I would probably give an example where you might need that and how would you use it. Alright, so legend. All of you guys, the legend element is used to give field sets a heading or caption so the user can see what a grouping of inputs is for. To create a legend, we use the legend element with the text we want to display within its opening and closing tags. A legend should always come right after an opening field set tag. A common use for these elements is using a field set to group radio buttons and using a legend to communicate to the user what each of those options is ultimately for. What would you like to drink? And coffee, tea, soda. Alright. A note on styling forms. We will provide resources that go deep into styling forms in the assignment section that comes next. However, before we get to the assignment, we should talk about some of the challenges with styling HTML forms and how we can get around them. So there are default browser styles and each browser has its own default styles for form controls, making your forms visually different for users depending on what browser they're using. To have a consistent design among all browsers, we have to override these default styles and style them ourselves. Tricky and downright impossible to style form controls. Text-based form controls like text, email, password, and text areas are reasonably straightforward to style. They operate like any other HTML element and most CSS properties can be used on them. Things get more tricky when creating custom styles for radio buttons and checkboxes, but there are many guides out there you can use to achieve your desired design, such as the guide on custom checkbox styling. Let me just skim through that. There has also been new CSS properties made available in recent times to make styling radio buttons and checkboxes much easier. Alright, font size. I like this one. Modern CSS.dev. These I cannot interact with, but I like how they look. Right. This is from MDN Web Docs. Limited availability, accent color. Also when you hover onto it. Cool. These are newer, I guess. I don't know what I need to do here. Alright, anyways. Certain aspects of other elements are downright impossible to style, for example, calendar or date pickers. If we want custom styles for these, we'll have to build custom form controls with JavaScript or use one of the many JavaScript libraries that provide us with ready-made solutions. So I think we have quite a bit of reading to do on forms, which is a bit annoying because I'm already familiar with them. But yeah, let's see. This is a short read. What about this? This one I feel like I can skip because I've already written a lot of forms. How to structure a web form. Okay, this is also pretty long. Styling guidelines. Read and follow along. So we're not going to follow along, I'm just telling you from now. But those three tabs are all the same article, just pointing to different sections of it. So I'll abstract it to one. I'll read through this and this HTML forms. Seems like a cool resource. Do you have any additional web dev form course? They have a whole course on this. How long is that? Sign in, save your progress. Hi there, bro, the snowman YouTube. What is going on, my man? Thanks for tuning in. Truly appreciate you. How is it going for you? Alright, I don't know how long this is, but it seems fun, so we can maybe go through this course as well. Please start C++ tutorial. I'm going through the Odin project, my guy, and we're doing full stack JavaScript, although I'm currently on intermediate CSS and HTML. I'm more passionate about advanced web development, so I'm going through the full stack JS. I'd love to learn C++, but this would probably be in the future once I've already stuck with the language for a while. I want to stick with one thing, let's say, for a given period of time, and then I can move on. But indeed, C++ is very interesting and you can do quite a lot with it. Alright, so let me get rid of everything I don't need here, such as those sidebars that are distracting, related topics, so on. I don't need these. Alright, much better. Are you a software developer? Yes, I'm working as a full-time mainframe COBOL developer. COBOL, I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but it's a very old dinosaur language used by banks to handle large transactions quickly. This is the code I'm writing day to day on my full-time job. But I want to transition to full stack. Alright, so web form building blocks. Do I have more coffee? Yes, I have a sip. Alright, so this module provides a series of articles that will help you master the essentials of web forms. Web forms are a very powerful tool for interacting with users. Most commonly, they're used for collecting data from users or allowing them to control a user interface. However, for historical and technical reasons, it's not always obvious how to use them to their full potential. In the articles listed below, we'll cover all the essential aspects of web forms, including marking up their HTML structure, styling form controls, validating form data, and submitting data to the server. The prerequisites, mastering forms, so on. But tell one thing, which coding language is better for app developer? I cannot say, man. What kind of apps are you trying to make? It's I don't do you want to make software that can be installed on a computer? Do you want to make web apps? Do you want to make mobile apps? Just tell me what are you, or like games, or what are you trying to build? Look at it as a tool, like Android. So for Android, what were there? Android dev. What was it? Swift, Kotlin, so on. I think Kotlin is a big with Android, and I think you needed Swift for iOS. So languages are just tools you can use. How a mechanic has different tools like wrenches and screwdrivers, so on, he uses for different jobs. It will depend on what you're trying to build, what language you need. So I can see you can use a lot of these. You can actually use HTML, CSS and so on to make an app, but I guess it will depend on what app. But I've heard mostly about Kotlin for Android, and I think it was Swift for iOS. Right. Mastering forms, however, requires more than just HTML knowledge. You also need to learn some specific techniques to style form controls, and some scripting knowledge is required to handle things like validation and creating custom form controls. Therefore, before you look at the other sections listed below, we'd recommend that you go away and learn some CSS and JS first. Alright, so that is done on my part. The above text is a good indicator as to why we've put web forms onto its own standalone module, rather than trying to mix its bits into the HTML, CSS and JavaScript topic areas. Form elements are more complex than most other HTML elements, and they also require a close marriage of related CSS and JavaScript techniques to get the most out of them. If you're working on a computer, tablet, where you don't have availability to create your own files, you try it, so on and so forth. Okay. Introductory guidelines. Bro, which company you work for? It's a bank. It's a large Belgian bank. Your first form. So what is that? This is I think it's this article. No, I've seen that article somewhere. Anyways, the first article in our series provides your very first experience of creating web form, including designing simple form, implementing it using HTML. So I understand now why this is so short, because it's a collection of articles, but how to structure a web form is the second one we're already going to read. Basic native form controls. HTML5 input types, styling web forms. Sure. I think I'm just going to go through this and this one because it seems well written, and we can maybe go through the course. We'll see how much time we have. Alright, let me get rid of the bold once again, just very quickly. Alright. How to structure a web form. The form element formally defines a form and attributes that determine the form's behavior. Each time you want to create an HTML form, you must start it by using this element, nesting all the contents inside. Many assistive technologies and browser plugins can discover form elements and implement special hooks to make them easier to use. So this for accessibility. We already made this in the previous article. It's strictly forbidden to nest a form inside another form. Nesting can cause forms to behave unpredictably, so it's a bad idea. It is always possible to use a form control outside of a form element. If you do so, by default, that control has nothing to do with any of the form unless you associate it with the form by using its form attribute. This was introduced to let you explicitly bind a control with a form even if it's not nested inside of it. Okay. Let's move forward and cover the structural elements you'll find nested in a form. Field set and nested elements, legend elements, I'm sorry. The field set element is a convenient way to create groups of widgets that serve the same purpose. For styling and semantic purposes, you can label a field set by including a legend element just below the opening field set tag. The text content of the legend formally describes the purpose of the field set it is included inside. Many assistive technologies will use the legend element as it's part of the label of each control inside of the corresponding field set element. For example, some screen readers such as JAWS and NVDA, not NVIDIA but NVDA, will speak the legend's content before speaking the labels of each control. So here's an example, and that's kind of what we had already in the Odin project lecture. When reading the above form, a screen loader will speak fruit juice size small for the first widget, fruit juice size medium for the second, and fruit juice size large. So he will repeat the legend for each input. Okay. To use the use case in this example is one of the most important. Each time you have a set of radio buttons, you should nest them inside a field set element. There are other use cases in general. The field set element can also be used to section a form. Ideally, long forms should be spread across multiple pages, but if a form is getting long and must be on a single page, putting the different related sections inside of different field sets improves usability. Because of its influence over assistive technologies, the field set element is one of the key elements for building accessible forms. However, it is your responsibility not to abuse it. If possible, each time you build a form, try to listen to how a screen reader interprets it. If it sounds odd, try to improve the form structure. So this is actually a good tip to actually use a screen reader and see how someone with accessibility issues will be, for example, if he's visually impaired, how he'll hear the form being spoken out. This is a very good tip. The label element, as we saw in the previous article, the label element is the formal way to define a label over an HTML form widget. This is the most important element if you want to build accessible forms. When implemented properly, screen readers will speak a form element's label along with any related instructions, as well as it being useful for sighted users. Take this example which we saw in the previous article. Alright, so what did we saw in the previous article? Label for name, input type text, ID of name, okay. With the label associated correctly with the input via its for attribute, which contains the input element's ID attribute, a screen reader will read out something like name, edit text. So it reads out the label and then tells you what you can do with that input field. There is another way to associate a form control with a label. Nest the form control within the label, implicitly associating it. Nest the form control within the label. So this time indeed, as you can see, the input is inside of the label. Even in such cases, however, it is considered best practice to set the for attribute to ensure all assistive technologies understand the relationship between label and widget. If there is no label, or if the form control is neither implicitly nor explicitly associated with the label, a screen reader will read out something like edit text blank, which isn't very helpful at all. Labels are clickable too. Another advantage of property setup labels is that you can click or tap the label to activate the corresponding widget. This is useful for controls like text inputs, where you can click the label as well as the input to focus it, but it's especially useful for radio buttons and checkboxes. The hit area of such a control can be very small, so it's useful to make it as easy to activate as possible. For example, clicking on the I like cherry label text in the example below will toggle the selected state of the taste cherry checkbox. Alright. Multiple labels. Strictly speaking, you can put multiple labels on a single widget, but this is not a good idea. Some assistive technologies can have trouble handling them. In the case of multiple labels, you should nest the widget and its labels inside a single label element. Required fields are allowed by... Okay. Right. Name. So they have the name as one label and the asterisk for required as another. The paragraph at the top states a rule for required elements. The rule must be included before it is used so that sighted users and users of assistive technologies such as screen readers can learn what it means before they encounter a required element. While this helps to inform users what an asterisk means, it cannot be relied upon. A screen reader will speak an asterisk as star when encountered. When hovered by a sighted mouse user, required should appear, which is achieved by the use of the title attribute. Titles being read aloud depends on the screen reader settings, so it's more reliable to also include the area label attribute, which is always read on by screen readers. Alright, the above variants increase the ineffectiveness as you go through them. In the first example, the label is not read out at all. With the input, you just get the edit text blank, plus the actual labels are read out separately. The multiple label elements confuse the screen reader. In the second example, things are a bit clearer. The label read out along with the input is name star name edit text required, and the labels are still read out separately. Things are still a bit confusing, but it's a bit better this time because the input has a label associated with it. And the third example is best. The actual label is read out all together, and the label read out with the input is name required edit text. Sure, you might get slightly different results depending on your screen reader. This was tested in VoiceOver and NVDA behave similarly. We'd love to hear your experiences too. You can find the example on GitHub. Okay. Common HTML structures used with forms. Beyond the structure specific to web forms, it is good to remember that form markups is just HTML. This means that you can use all the power of HTML to structure a form. I should drink more water when talking non-stop for hours. As you can see in this example, it's common practice to wrap a label and its widget with a list item element within an unordered list or an ordered list. P and div elements are also commonly used. Lists are recommended for structuring multiple checkboxes or radio buttons. Okay. In addition to field set element, it is also common practice to use HTML titles in example H1, H2 and sectioning example sections to structure complex forms. Above all, it is up to you to find a comfortable coding style that results in accessible, usable forms. Each separate section of functionality should be continued in a separate section element, with field set elements to contain radio buttons. Alright, so this is an interactive lesson on building a form, which I will skip again because I'm familiar with how to build a form. We'll have a project later on which we'll need to make a sign-up form, and I'll code along on stream, but I don't think I'll have any problems with that since I've done it multiple times. Alright, so again, this is quite large. I don't know if we'll be able to finish it on stream. Let me take a quick 5-minute break and I'll be right back because I want to take a break from talking. So quick 5 minutes and I'll be right back with you guys. Thanks so much. Alright, I'm back, and I guess we can continue with this article. I'll try to be quick with it. Because I have like 30 minutes and I have to go to work. But let's see if we can finish it by then. So, HTML form elements lets you collect input from your website's visitors. Mailing lists, contact forms, and blog posts. Comments are common examples for small websites. But in organizations that rely on their website for revenue, forms are sacred and revered. Forms are the money pages. They're how e-commerce sites sell their products, how SaaS companies collect payment for their servers, and how non-profit groups raise money online. Many companies measure the success of their website by the effectiveness of its forms, because they answer questions like how many leads did our website send to our sales team, and how many people signed up for the product last week. This often means that forms are subjected to endless A/B tests and optimizations. There are two aspects of a functional HTML form: the front-end interface and the back-end server. The former is the appearance of the form as defined by HTML and CSS, while the latter is the code that processes it, storing data in a database, sending an email, etc. We'll be focusing entirely on the front end this chapter, leaving back-end form processing for a future tutorial. Alright, so unfortunately there is really no getting around the fact that styling forms is hard. It's always a good idea to have a mockup representing the exact page you want to build before you start coding it up, but this is particularly true for forms. Here is an example we'll be creating in this chapter. Okay, so they have the desktop and the mobile version. As you can see, this is a speaker submission form for a fake conference. It hosts a pretty good selection of HTML form elements, various types of text field, a group of radio buttons, a drop-down menu, a checkbox, and submit button. Create a new item project. Alright, next, create styles. Okay, notice that we are adhering to the mobile first development approach that we discussed in the responsive design chapter. These base CSS rules give us our mobile layout and provide a foundation for a desktop layout too. We'll create the media query for a fixed with desktop layout later in the chapter. HTML forms. Onto the forms. Every HTML form begins with the aptly named formed element. It accepts a number of attributes, but the most important ones are the action and method. Go ahead and add an empty form to your HTML document right under the header. The action attribute defines the URL that processes the form. It is where the input collected by the form is sent when user clicks the submit button. This is actually a special URL defined by your web server that knows how to process the data. Common backend technologies for processing forms include Node.js, PHP, and Ruby on Rails, but again we'll be focusing on the front end in this chapter. The method attribute can be either post or get, both of which define how the form is submitted to the backend server. This is largely dependent on how your web server wants to handle the form, but the general rule of thumb is to use post when you're changing data on the server and reserving get for when you're only getting data. Getting, not gating. Oh, we got a subscriber, I just saw. Thank you so much whoever subscribed. I really appreciate you, my brother or sister. Thank you so much. By leaving the action attribute blank, we're telling the form to submit to the same URL combined with the get method This will let us inspect the contents of the form. Alright, so styling forms. Of course, we're looking at an empty form right now, but that doesn't mean we can't add styles to it. So we would want a container div that will turn it into a box that matches our header element. Text input fields. To actually collect user input, we need a new tool, the input element. Insert the following to your form. So this is to take in a name and a label. First, we have a container div to help with styling. This is pretty common for separating input elements. Second, we have a label, which you can think of as another semantic HTML element like article or fig caption, but for form elements. A label's for attribute must match the ID attribute of its associated input element. Third, the input element creates a text field. It's a little different from other elements we've encountered because it can dramatically change the appearance depending on its type attribute, but it always creates some kind of interactive user input. We'll see other values besides text throughout the chapter. Remember that ID selectors are bad. The ID attribute here is only for connecting it to a label element. ID selectors are bad. I'm not sure what they mean by that, but conceptually, an input element represents a variable that gets sent to the backend server. The name attributes define the name of this variable, and the value is whatever the user entered into the text field. Know that you can pre-populate this value by adding a value attribute to an input element. Styling text input fields. An input element can be styled with any other HTML element. Let's add some CSS to style.css to pretty it up a bit. Alright, so these are all the styles they add. That's okay. So here they don't use the ID, for example, but to style all the inputs of type text, they do input in brackets type text, which is clever actually. The input type text part is a new type of CSS selector called an attribute selector. It only matches input elements that have a type attribute equal to text. This lets us specify target text fields, specifically target text fields opposed to radio buttons, which are defined by the same HTML element. You can read more about that. All of our styles are namespaced in a .form-row descendant selector. Isolating input and label styles like this makes it easier to create different kinds of forms. We'll see why it's convenient to avoid global input types text and label selectors once we get into radio buttons. Finally, let's tweak these styles to create our desktop layout. Media query, so currently that's what they have. Check out that awesome use of flex direction property to make the label appear on top of its input if it's on mobile. Sure. Email input fields. The input fields also lets you do basic input validation. For example, let's try adding another input element that only accepts email address instead of arbitrary text values. So we already know about this to validate your inputted email. This works exactly like the type text input, except it automatically checks that the users entered an email address. In Firefox, you can try typing something that's not an email address, then clicking outside of the text field to make it lose focus and validate its input. It should turn red to show the user that it has an incorrect value. Chrome and Safari don't attempt to validate until user tries to submit the form, so we'll see this in action later in this chapter. This is more than just validation though. By telling browsers that we're looking for an email address, they can provide a more intuitive user experience. For instance, when smartphone browsers see this type text attribute, it gives the user a special email specific keyboard with an easily accessible add character. Also, when you autofill something, it knows that it's an email and it will show you the email address you typically use. When you notice the new placeholder attribute that lets you display some default text when the input element is empty, also notice, not when you notice. This is a nice little UX technique to prompt the user to input their own value. There is a bunch of other built-in validation options besides the email address, which you can read about in this article. Styling email input fields. Okay, we don't want a plain old input type selector here because that would style all of our input elements, including our upcoming radio buttons and checkboxes. This is part of what makes styling forms tricky. Understanding the CSS to poke out exactly the elements you want is a crucial skill. Let's not forget about our desktop styles. Update the corresponding input type text rule in our media query to match the following. Okay, since we can now have a right and wrong input value, we should probably convey that to users. The invalid and valid pseudo classes let us style these states independently. For example, maybe we want to render both the border and the text with a custom shade of red when the user entered an unacceptable value. Add the following rule to your style sheet outside of the media query. Until we include the submit button, you'll only be able to see this in Firefox, but you get the idea. There is a similar pseudo class called focus that selects an element the user is currently filling out. This gives you a lot of control over the appearance of your forms. So indeed, you can style the different states of the form input fields, like when it's focused, if it's invalid, if it's valid, so on. This gives us a lot of flexibility. So radio buttons. Changing the type property of the inputs element to radio transforms it into a radio button. Radio buttons are a little more complex to work with than text fields because they always operate in groups, allowing the user to choose one of the many predefined options. This means that we not only need a label for each input element, but also a way to group radio buttons and label the entire group. This is what field set and legend elements are for. Every radio button group you create should be wrapped in a field set, which is labeled with a legend. Associate a label element with each radio button. Use the same name attribute for each radio button in the group. Use different value attributes for each radio button. Okay. Our radio button example has all of these components. Add the following to your form elements underneath the email field. Okay. Sure. Unlike text fields, the users can't enter custom values into a radio button, which is why each of them needs an explicit value attribute. This is the value that will get sent to the server when the user submits a form. It's also very important that each radio button has the same name attribute, otherwise the form wouldn't know they were part of the same group. We also introduced a new attribute that called checked. This is a boolean attribute, meaning that it never takes a value. It either exists or it doesn't exist on an input element. If it doesn't exist on either a radio button or a checkbox element, that element will be selected checked by default. Does exist, not doesn't exist, I'm sorry. styling radio buttons. We have a few things working against us when we try when it comes to styling radio buttons. First, there is simply more elements to worry about. Second, the feud set and legend elements have rather ugly default styles, and there is not a whole lot of consistency in these defaults across browsers. Third, at the time of this writing, feud set doesn't support Flexbox. So I don't know when this was written and if it supports Flexbox now, but we can check. We got another subscriber. Thank you so much to whoever subscribed. I really appreciate you, my guy or girl. Thank you so much. So don't fret. This is a good example of floats being a useful fallback for legacy troublesome elements. You notice that we didn't wrap the radio buttons in our existing form row class, opting instead for a new legacy form row class. This is because it's going to be completely separate from our other elements using floats instead of Flexbox. Okay, so mobile layout and desktop layout, they're using floats, which I don't know if anyone uses nowadays. I'll have to check if let me check because I'm curious. Does field sets support Flexbox? This if it's supported by browsers. Flex grid layouts not working. Yeah, I'm still not sure if they work anyways. Start with the mobile tables, so on so forth. They're styling it up for desktop layout. I'm not coding along, so I'm not reading through these. As far as layouts go, this is a pretty good cross-browser solution. However, customizing the appearance of the actual button is another story. It's possible by taking advantage of the checked attribute, but it's a little bit complicated. We'll leave you to Google custom radio button CSS and explore that rabbit hole on your own. Alright, so we have next the drop downs, which is a select and then a couple of options, and this will make a drop down. Drop down menus offer an alternative to radio buttons, as they let the user select one of many options. The select elements represents the drop down menu, and it contains a bunch of option elements that can represent each item. Just like our radio button input elements, we can have name and value attributes that get passed to the backend server, but instead of being defined on a single element, they're spread across the select and option elements. And you can also have a selected attribute, I believe, or checked, but I think it's selected. Styling, select elements, and also just like our radio buttons, select elements are notoriously hard to style. However, there is a reason for this. Dropdowns are a complex piece of interactivity, and their behavior changes significantly across devices. For instance, on an iPhone, clicking a select statement brings up a native scrolling UI component that makes it much easier to navigate through the menu. It is usually a good idea to let the browser device determine the best way to present a select element, so we'll be keeping our CSS pretty simple. Unfortunately, even the simplest things are surprisingly hard. For instance, trying to change the font size on our select element. This won't work in Chrome and Safari, so you have to add the WebKit appearance none. Alright. The WebKit prefix will only apply to Chrome and Safari, which are powered by the WebKit rendering engine, while Firefox will remain unaffected. This is effectively a hack, and even MDN says not to use the CSS property. Style difficulties like this are a serious consideration when building a form. If you need custom styles, you may be better off using radio buttons or JavaScript UI widgets. Bootstrap dropdowns and jQuery select menus are common JavaScript solutions for customizing select menus. In any case, at least you now understand the problem. You can read more about select issues here. Okay. Text areas now. Text area element creates a multi-line text field designed to collect large amounts of text from the user. They're suitable for things like biographies, essays, and comments. Go ahead and add a text area. Okay. Styling the text area. By default, many browsers let users resize text area elements to whatever dimensions they want. We disable this here with the resize property, so they set resize of none. Cool. We also need a little tweak in our desktop layout. The instructions div needs to be underneath the text area, so let's nudge it left by the width of the label column. Okay. Checkboxes, they are sort of radio buttons, but instead of selecting only one options, they let the user pick as many as they want. This simplifies things since the browser doesn't need to know which checkboxes are part of the same group. In other words, we don't need a field set, wrapper, or shared name attributes. Add the following to the end of your form. So they're adding checkboxes, and the way we used label here was a little different than previous sections. Instead of being a separate element, the label wraps its corresponding input element. This is perfectly legal, and to make it easier to match our desired layout, it's still best practice to use the for attribute. So, styling checkboxes. For the mobile layout, all we need to do is override the margin bottom that we put on the rest of the label elements. Add the following inside the media queries. Okay. By wrapping both the checkbox and the label text, we're able to use a width auto to make the entire form field be on a single line. Remember that the auto width makes the box match the size of its context. Okay, sure. Submit buttons. Finally, let's finish off our form with a submit button. The button elements represents a button that will submit its containing form. Clicking the button tells the browser to validate all of the input elements in the form and submit it to the action URL. If there aren't any validation problems, so you should now be able to type in something that's not an email address onto our email field. Click the button and see an error message. This also gives us a chance to see how the user's input gets sent to the server. First, enter some values into the input fields, making sure the email address validates correctly. Then click the button and inspect the resulting URL in your browser. You should see something like this. Okay. Everything after the question mark represents the variables in our form. Each input's name attribute is followed by an equal sign, then its value, and each variable is separated by an AND character. If we had a backend server, it'd be pretty easy for it to pull all of this out, pull out all this information, query a database or whatever, and let us know whether the form submission was successful or not. So indeed, here we have a full name of Rick, email of Rick at internetingisHard.com, talk type workshop, t-shirt is L, unabstract equals derp, availability is available. Okay. Styling buttons. we had some experience with styling buttons in the pseudo classes section of the CSS selectors chapter. Back then we were applying these styles to an A element, but now we can use the same techniques on a button. They basically give us the styles, and after that we have the summary. There is something about Ajax, but in this chapter we introduce the most common HTML form elements. We now have all of these tools for collecting input from our website visitors. You should be pretty comfortable with the HTML and CSS required to build beautiful forms, but actually making these forms functional requires some skills we don't have yet. That stuff is out of scope for this tutorial, but it might help to have some context. Generally speaking, there are two ways to process forms. Use the action attribute to send the form data to a backend URL, which then redirects to a success error or error page. We got a little glimpse of this in the previous section, and it doesn't require any JavaScript. Use Ajax queries to submit the form without leaving the page. Success or error messages are displayed on the same page by manipulating the HTML with JavaScript. Depending on how your organization is structured, form processing may not be a part of your job role as a front-end web developer. If that's the case, you need to coordinate closely with a backend developer on your team to make sure the form submits the correct name value pairs. Otherwise, it will be up to you to make sure the front end and back end of your forms fit neatly together. Next, we have our final chapter in HTML and CSS is hard. We'll round out our front end skills with a thorough discussion of webs, fonts, and practical typographic principle that every developer should know about. Alright, perfect. So that article was pretty extensive, and now we have the course, which we'll not tackle today because it's already time to leave for work. So thank you guys for tuning in today's live stream. It was a pleasure having you. Thank you so much for everyone that subscribed right here, and I'll see you guys either later today or tomorrow. Thank you and peace out. Bye bye.